Tonight I'm doing a special lecture, a lecture about Torah Shebal Peh, about the Oral Torah, which will help us understand the following week's lectures concerning why the Torah Shebal Peh was not written down in the very beginning and so forth. All those questions of the series, the 70 most difficult questions that have something to do with the Torah. So I decided today to give an introduction, an overview about what exactly is the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition. Torah is from Lashon Hora'ah. The word Torah means instruction. This Torah was given to us by Kadosh Baruch Hu with all the instructions that we need to know in order to be able to fulfill the commandments, in order for us to be guided properly in our life. In other words, it is self-contained in a sense. Even though the Torah is divine, our tradition is very clear about who wrote it down. Moshe Rabbeinu was the first one to write it down, but it was dictated to him by Hashem. It's important to have clarity about this point because, as you know, the Reform movement has some issues with that. Unfortunately, they don't believe that the Torah is divine. The conservative movement have other issues. They believe that they can alter the Torah, which they believe is divine, but they can make changes to it as they see fit. But as we've discussed in the past, the Torah is not subject to change. The Torah was given to us complete, and it was dictated to Moshe by Kadosh Baruch Hu. Since it is very important that we have the exact version of the Torah, and that no changes have been made, Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, were always very careful when a new Torah would be written down. They would copy it from a book, from a sefer, that they knew was accurate. They would check it many, many times. Not one letter could be missing. Otherwise, you could not read from it. It would be pasul. So we see great emphasis throughout history in being very careful that the Torah should be written down accurately. Even though most of us are familiar with the Torah being Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in reality, when we use the word Torah, we're referring to a larger volume of books. We also mean the Nevi'im Uktuvim, the prophets, and the scriptures, and we also mean the Midrash and the Zohar. After all, there are many, many details of the stories and of the halachot that are not all documented in the Torah. And we'll explain it as we go along with the series as to why these things were left out, why they were not written down in the very beginning. There's a lot of secrets, a lot of mysticism, a lot of drashot that you will find in a book called Midrash or in the Kabbalah. The Torah that we know, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, which includes not only the stories ever since creation and the story of the Jewish people, it contains mitzvot, and these mitzvot are divided into something called Torah Shebechtav and Torah Shebal Peh. Even though the mitzvot themselves, all 613 of them, are in the Torah Shebechtav, in the written Torah, there are aspects of them and details of them that are documented in the Oral Torah, which is what the subject of tonight is all about. What exactly is this Torah Shebal Peh? There's another category called Halacha LeMoshe Misinai. Halacha LeMoshe Misinai means that this is a halacha from Moshe, even though it is not necessarily learned directly from a word or a phrase in the Torah, but it has been handed down from Moshe in Sinai. And when I say, or when I use the word handed down, I use it for a reason. In Pirkei Avot, it says, Moshe kibel Torah b'Sinai, umsara liYoshua, and he handed it over to Yeshua. It doesn't say he gave it. What's the difference between giving it and handing it over? To give, you just give over. You don't bother to see if the person understands it. Umsara means that he gave it over exactly how he knew it, with all its details. Didn't leave anything out. Whatever he could, he gave it over to Yeshua. So Yeshua, being a student of Moshe, being alive at the time of Moshe, received from Moshe the exact version of the Torah as Moshe received it from Hashem. There are some ideas that are brought down in the Gemara and later on in the various books in Halakha that are called Gzerot Chazal, Takanot Chazal, what we call Midrabanan. It is not from the Torah, it is by rabbinic decree. These were additional decrees or laws not to change the Torah, not to add to the Torah necessarily, but to protect the Torah. As it says in the Pasuk, Ushmartem et mishmarti. We are responsible to protect the Torah, that it be preserved, that nothing should happen, chas v'shalom, where people will make a mistake, misunderstand. After all, we're only human, and these things can happen. So how do we protect? The rabbis of the generation have the authority, especially back then when we had the Sanhedrin, during the time of the Tanaim and the Moraim, where they really had a lot of authority. Part of that authority was to preserve the Torah and to make any necessary decrees which they felt was necessary at the time. A quick example of something which is midrabanan, but a rabbinic decree, is that we cannot have milk with chicken. Too bad, right? In case you wanted to have some, you can't, because it's assumed midrabanan. The Torah says you cannot have a steak with milk, but it doesn't say you can't have chicken. So the rabbi said, well, people can make the mistake. They see somebody eating chicken with a glass of milk, they'll say, oh, he's having meat, because they look alike. And because they look alike, and we want to protect the Torah, we don't want a Jew to transgress the Torah, the mitzvah, as it is written down. Therefore, we're going to forbid him, we're going to limit him. We're not changing the Torah, but we're going to restrict him for his own good, for his own benefit. And this is really also for the benefit of the Torah. So that's not called changing the Torah. It's called preserving the Torah. It's called preserving the mitzvah. This Torah, throughout history, despite all the persecutions and all the troubles that we had and the dispersion in the diaspora, has always been preserved. This has been a promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shelo Tishakach, that it will never be forgotten. There will always be those who will be able to take the Torah and transmit it to future generations, to teach it. And if you would want to see a list of direct transmission of those who were involved or are part of this transmission, I can show you a list from Moshe Rabbeinu till the rabbis of today. Direct. Who his rabbi was, who his rabbi was, who his rabbi was, who his rabbi was. All the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, there is no interruption in the way. The shalshelet, the whole transmission of the Torah, has not been interrupted whatsoever. Before we begin the lecture, I perhaps should mention two groups that we never really talked about too much. And they are Tzdukim Ubaitusim and the Karaites. Who are they? It's important to talk about them right now because it has something to do with their group. During the Second Temple era, towards the end, there was a lot of politics going on. Not everybody liked the authority and the power that the rabbis had, and they did have a lot of power back then. Here they're clarifying, interpreting, dictating, making additional restrictions, and what appears to be their opinion, based of course on what on their way of understanding the Torah. And not everybody liked that. And there was a school of philosophy formed that was called Sadok and Baitos, that basically said, we only interpret the Torah literally. We will not allow the rabbis to tell us what this word means unless it's literally the translation of the word. There's one opinion that they did not believe in the world to come because of something that they heard in a class that Antigonos Ish ben Socho said. Antigonos Ish Socho said, don't fulfill the mitzvot in anticipation of reward. Fulfill the mitzvot without anticipation for reward. In other words, do that for the sake of Hashem. Do it for its real purpose. And they twisted that to think, oh, what he's basically saying is that there's no reward, so there's no world to come. That's one opinion. Nevertheless, what really went on is that they did not want to subject themselves to the authority of the rabbis. Rabbis were called the Prushim, and they were called the Tzdukim and Baitusim. And there are various differences. There are various areas of the Torah where they differed, and we don't have the time to go into all of them. They disappeared. Baruch Hashem, they're not around, but unfortunately other groups that are a little bit somewhat similar have taken over from them. Reform and conservative. Similar groups, but with a different agenda, perhaps. Another group that emerged was the Karaites, the Karaim, and they're still around, even though they don't number too many. And they came about sometime during the time of the Geonim, perhaps a little bit earlier, in Bavel, in Babylonia. They also had problems with the Chachamim having too much authority. And very similar to the Tzdukim, but somewhat different, they did not interpret the Torah exactly the way our tradition had it. One of the things that stands out about the Karaites that was very different than even the Tzdukim was that on Shabbat they don't have any light. It says, Lo tevaru esh b'chol moshvotechem, you cannot have any light. And we, of course, interpret that to mean you cannot turn on the light, you cannot burn a fire. But if you leave it on before Shabbat, it's perfectly okay. And they would sit in darkness. I'm told that today they don't sit in darkness because they have some sort of battery backup that they use with fluorescent lighting that somehow they allow. But anyway, they had also a different way of understanding the Torah, and all they gave any importance to was the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah. The diaspora itself caused certain differences to emerge between various communities, and they're called minhagim, which we'll speak about separately, customs, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, Temanim, and this is as a result of galut, diaspora. This is just minhagim. This is not changes in the Torah. It's still the same Torah, but there's some customs that are different. One of the things that stands out the most, that is very, very different, is the pronunciation of the Torah. Whether you're Yemenite or Ashkenaz or Sephardi, and even amongst the Sephardi and the Ashkenaz, there are various forms of pronouncing the same word. And very soon when Mashiach comes, B'ezrat Hashem, we will have one pronunciation. In the meantime, as a result of being dispersed all over the world, the languages of the country where we live affect us, and of course that is part of the reason why various communities pronounce the Lashon HaKodesh or say their prayers using a different pronunciation. Every nation, every civilization respects its own culture, and it would have been very, very nice if all the Jews would have done so too. But unfortunately, the Jewish nation, being a stubborn nation, has had many issues, not only with the rabbis, but with its own tradition, with its own culture. And it's a shame that something that's been so precious to us for so many years, something that our forefathers were willing to give their lives for, is looked down by some, or they simply don't take interest in. But you know, when these same individuals do take interest, all of a sudden, as soon as they finish the army in Israel, they travel to India. And in India, they want to go see the guru. And to get to see a guru, you have to fast, you have to immerse yourself in the waters, you have to work very, very hard, you perhaps have to meditate. I don't know what they go through, but it's not easy. And they finally get to the guru, and the guru asks them the following question: where are you from? And they say, from Israel. Well, shame on you. What are you doing here? Everything that I know, that I teach is from you. What are you coming to get it from me here? Go back home. In other words, the guru has to reveal to this Israeli, to this Jew, that all they know comes from us. But unfortunately, that Jew did not bother to discover, to find out in Israel what his Torah is all about. He has to go find it out somewhere else. But Baruch Hashem, at least they find out somehow, at some point. I just want to add one more point, and that is that it is a known thing that the greatest enemy of the Jew is ignorance. For a Jew to not know his Torah puts him in great trouble. Because if some missionary, some goy, somebody who wants to mislead him, approaches him and asks him questions that he is not prepared to answer, and he proves it to him from a Bible, and that Jew cannot even read his own Bible in the original language, well, guess what's going to happen? He may fall into a trap. So that's why it's so important for us to become familiar with the Torah, Torah shebichtav, Torah shebal peh, in the original language if possible, to truly be able to appreciate this great treasure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us, as the Pasuk says, Ki lekach tov natati lachem, Torati al ta'azovu. I have given you something so precious, a precious asset. Please, don't abandon it. Don't let go of it. Okay, so let's begin with Torah shebal peh. Even though I wrote it in Hebrew, but I think most of you will understand, we are going to talk about three important questions. What is the Torah shebal peh? Why is it not enough to have Torah shebichtav, the written word, the written Torah? And who's to say that the Torah shebal peh also obligates us to do as it says? There are some additional questions which we'll cover another time. Why wasn't the Torah shebal peh written down? That's why it's called Bal Peh. It's the oral word. Today it's written down. But why in the very beginning wasn't it not written down? We'll talk about that perhaps next week. And if the Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh, if all is really one, if all was given at the same time, then how is it possible that we have mahlokot, Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai, various opinions about certain areas of halakha? We'll talk about that another time. Just for a little bit of history, in the year 2448 from creation, that is when all of Am Yisrael stood in Har Sinai and received the Torah. The Aseret HaDibrot, we heard from Hashem, the Ten Commandments, the ones that were written in the Luchot. We heard directly from Hashem, but the rest of the Torah Moshe received from Hashem. When did he receive it? As the Torah clearly tells us, when he was in the Shamayim, he spent enough time there, 40 days and nights, to be able to get to receive the Torah and its details, and to have an understanding of all its details. It's brought down in Masechet Megillah. ועליהם ככל הדברים אשר דיבר השם עמכם בהר. We learn out from this pasuk that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe all the details, all the fine details of the various halachot and mitzvot in Torah, including what will be eventually taught by some student, by some rabbi in the future generation. In other words, Moshe received everything that he needed to know, and everything that will eventually be taught in the future as well. There's a story in Masechet Shabbat about a goy who came to Shammai. I want to convert. And he asks him, how many Torah do you have? So Shammai tells him 2, Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh. So the goy says, convert me only on condition that you teach me the Torah shebichtav. I don't want to learn the Torah shebal peh, the oral. That's made up by the rabbis, like some people claim. So Shammai was very strict. He was a very strict person. He says, get out of here. I'm not interested in you. He went to Hillel, asked him to be converted, and Hillel tells him, okay, let's start from the Aleph Bet. This is an Aleph, this is a Bet, this is what a Gimel looks like, this is what a Dalet looks like. The next day he came back and he switched the letters around. The Aleph, he says, this is a Gimel. And the Bet says, this is a Dalet. He says, wait a minute. Yesterday you told me something else and today you're changing your mind? He says, well, if you're trusting me, what I'm telling you is an Aleph, what I'm telling you is a Bet, then trust me with the Torah Shebal Peh as well. He, of course, convinced him. And based on that, of course, he was able to teach him both Torah Shebichtav and Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebichtav is something which is very clear. It's documented. As long as we understand the language, we should be able to figure out more or less what it's telling us. However, there's a problem. When we read the Torah on Shabbat, during the holidays, there are no vowels in there. How do you know how to pronounce the letters? How do you know what it's telling you without vowels? If you have a letter without a vowel in Hebrew, it can have various meanings. That in itself is proof that you need Torah Shebal Peh. You need the oral tradition that tells you how to pronounce this word, what this word means. Without that, you wouldn't understand. Just by that alone. So the vowels themselves are proof that we cannot have a Torah Shebichtav without the Torah Shebal Peh. The transmission of the Torah went from Moshe to Yoshua, from Yoshua to the Zekanim, from the Zekanim to the prophets gave it to the Anshe Knesset Agdolah. That is why you will find additional books, the Nevi'im, Yoshua, Shoftim, Shemuel, Malachim, and so forth, and you will find Ketuvim, Tehillim, Iyov, Mishlei, Ruth, and Shir Hashirim, and so forth. All of these, as I mentioned earlier, are part of the Torah. Nevertheless, what is the big difference between them? That the Torah Shebichtav, as we call it, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, was dictated to Moshe from Hashem, and these were written down by various prophets, Beruach HaKodesh, through divine inspiration. So they're obviously holy books themselves too, but it's not in par with the Torah, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. It's on a different level. Nevertheless, they're all important to us because they all contain information that we need to know. What came afterwards? The Torah Shebichtav, including the Nevi'im Uchtuvim, are sealed. They cannot be changed. Malachi is the last prophet. What came later is that the Torah Shebal Peh was documented, it was written down. Who wrote the Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He compiled what we have today, or what is known as the Mishnayot. In the Mishnah, there are 6 volumes, or 6 sedarim, I should say. Divisions, yes. And each division covers a different aspect of Jewish life. Seder Zra'im covers all the mitzvot that have something to do with agriculture, with the land. Seder Moed covers the holidays and Shabbat. Seder Nashim covers all the mitzvot and halachot that have something to do with marriage, divorce. Seder Nezikim has to do with damages, relations between oneself and one's neighbor. Then we have Kodashim, which has to do with the Bet HaMikdash and the sacrifices. And then we have Taharot, which has to do with that which is pure or not pure, unclean. These Mishnayot, even though they contain many halachot, as it is known to us as Torah Shebal Peh, was later further elaborated. It was further discussed to bring out more halachot and to try to understand it better. And that is where the Gemara or the Talmud came to be. We have 2 Talmuds, 2 Gemarot. One is called Bavli, one is called Yerushalmi. Talmud Bavli is Babylonian because it was composed in Bavel, where the Jews went after the destruction of the Second Temple. But you also had some Tanaim who were still in Eretz Israel, and they composed the Talmud Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi was written a little bit before the Bavli, but more or less they were both written at the same time. through the various Amoraim. The Amoraim came after the Tanaim, several hundred years after the Tanaim. So we're talking about a little over 1600 years ago when the Gemara was written down. If you were to look at a Gemara today, besides the text itself of the Mishnah, followed by the Gemara, you will see many commentaries surrounding this Torah Shebal Peh, as we call it, which is now written down. You will have Rashi, you will have Tosafot, you will have Masoret Hashas, Ein Mishpat, Tosafot Yeshanim, various commentaries that help us understand the text a little bit better. One of the most important commentaries of Torah Shebal Peh and Torah Shebechtav is Rashi, known as Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived about 900 years ago. This is not a real picture of him. It's just on one of those paintings that they have. But he grew up in France and Germany, or the area called Normandy. And he was known, and he is known, as perhaps the most famous, greatest commentator of all times. Without his commentary on Chumash, on Gemara, we would not understand very well what's going on. The generations today are weaker in their understanding, in their ability to grasp what was written down in the Gemara, and therefore it is to his credit that every one of us can today study Chumash and have some understanding of what is going on. And of course, it is to his credit that we are able to follow the Gemara. Without his commentary, it would be very, very difficult for one to understand the text. Another important commentator, not so much a commentator I should say, but one who organized the many, many mitzvot and halachot in a great masterpiece called the Yad HaChazakah, is the Rambam, Maimonides, who lived about 750 to 800 years ago. He was born in Spain, moved when he was very young to Morocco, then went to Israel and was in Egypt, and spent many years in Egypt as a doctor. And he is known not only for the Yad HaChazakah, but also for other commentaries on the Mishnah, some works on philosophy, and on medicine. Tremendous contribution to Am Yisrael. And the big book called Yad HaChazakah is an important achievement, because what he did was to organize a lot of the conclusions or resolutions that are brought down in the Gemara. In Gemara you have many opinions perhaps, and what do? Which one do you follow? So he compiled, he did a tremendous job in compiling the various conclusions in the Gemarot and mitzvot. He clarified them, organized them, and tremendous book and tremendous resource in case you want to look up almost any mitzvah, any halacha that is mentioned anywhere in the Gemara in an organized fashion. You find it in the Rambam. However, that book that he put together covers many, many mitzvot, many, many halachot, many that are not relevant today. And at the time that Rambam lived, there was already a dispersion. Am Yisrael already was being scattered all over the world, and other schools emerged, and other opinions concerning certain areas of halakha emerged, and there was a need to further sort through the various opinions as to what is relevant today. So, great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yosef Karo, or as he's known as the Bet Yosef, put together a great book called the Shulchan Aruch, which is our book of halakha that we follow today. And his compilation was based on three great rabbis, the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh. And whenever there was differences of opinion between them, he basically decided the halakha most of the time by 2 versus 1. and it was by the majority. And his book, the Shulchan Aruch, was accepted all over the world. It's accepted by all of Am Yisrael as the Shulchan Aruch, as the book, the code of laws that we follow. That is how we live our lives today. And this book, of course, contains just about all the halachot that one needs to know. There are still some things that come up from time to time in every generation that we need poskim, we need great rabbis who are familiar with the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemarot to be able to figure out what to do. Complicated issues. Because of technology, because the times have changed, the Torah does not change, but we still need a great rabbi who's familiar with the halakha and the entire Torah Shebal Peh to be able to tell us what do we do in this case that is not documented anywhere. They did not have this problem back then. Quick example. Can you make Havdalah on a light bulb? It's Shabbat, you don't have a candle, and here you have a light bulb. Is a light bulb like fire or not? Well, there are opinions that say yes, but not for Hanukkah. For Hanukkah, you have to use the real thing. You have to use olive oil. The miracle occurred with olive oil. Follow me? So, in order for somebody to make that determination on something which did not exist in the past, he needs to be familiar with all the aspects of the Torah to be able to make that determination. That is a copy of the cover of one of the earlier prints of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, since the Shulchan Aruch also has many customs, what is the problem with that? The problem is that the Shulchan Aruch was born in Spain, moved to Portugal, later moved to Turkey, and eventually to Eretz Israel. Many of the customs of the minhagim that he brings down in his book, the Shulchan Aruch, really are more Sephardic Jews. The Ashkenaz Jews at this time already have minhagim of their own. So, as this book was coming out, another great rabbi in Europe, Eastern Europe, by the name of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who lived in Krakow, put his comments, added his comments to the Shulchan Aruch, and they most of the time reflect the custom or tradition of Eastern European Jews. For the most part. I mean, there are European Jews of the Hasidic school that perhaps may follow other traditions, but for the most part, most European Jews, when it comes to certain customs, follow the Ramah, as he's called, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, and you can still visit his shul in Krakow, and that's where he's buried. What happened after Rabbi Moshe Isserles? By the way, the Bet Yosef, or the Shulchan Aruch, passed away in the year 1575. He's considered from the first Achronim. That is the period of time in our history when we're moving from Rishonim to Achronim. Rishonim are the very first generations after the period of the Geonim, after the period of the Gemara. We then afterwards have a period called Achronim. And today we're the Achronim of the Achronim, the end of the end. One of the Achronim of our generation, a famous one, was called Rabbi Israel Meir HaKohen, or as he's better known as the Hafetz Chaim, who put together also many great important books that many of us have in our homes. One of them is the Mishnah Berurah, perhaps the most famous of all his works. And what the Mishnah Berurah is a further clarification of one section of the Shulchan Aruch called Orach Chaim. That is the one that we use the most. From the moment we wake up, all our activities during the day, Shabbat, Chagim, Tefillin, right, Tzitzit, Tefillah, all of that is in the section called Orach Chaim, a very important section that every one of us should be as familiar as possible. Halakha is something that we always need to review because we forget, and there are many, many details. And what he did was he took the Shulchan Aruch and further clarified it for our generation in a language that is easy to understand. Plus he brought various other sources and introduced various situations which are not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch So together, between the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah, one is really able to understand with a lot more clarity the subject matter that he's learning. He was a great big tzaddik, passed away in 1933. He was known for being very careful with Lashon Hara, not to gossip. He wrote a lot about that. A lot of important books that were printed not too long ago by the Chafetz Chaim.
He wrote 30 different stories.
How much?
30 different stories.
30 different stories. A lot of these books are around with us.
Even online.
Yeah. And they should be learned. They should be studied by everyone. Okay, now let's go over to the second part of the lecture. Why isn't the Torah Shebechtav enough? Why do we have to have a Torah Shebal Peh? So I mentioned before that one example was the pronunciation. Now I'm going to show you a few mitzvot, a few examples, that without the Torah Shebal Peh, it would be impossible for us to figure it out, to figure out the mitzvah. Just a couple sources as to how we know we have both. It says so, Ele HaChokim VaTorot LaMishpatim Asher Natan Hashem Beno Uven Bnei Yisrael Behar Sinai B'Yad Moshe. It says the word Torot in plural. So we learn out in the Midrash, Torot Melamed Sheshtei Torot Nitun Lahem Yisrael Achad B'Chtav Achad Bal Peh. We have two, even though it doesn't say it clearly, it's insinuated in the word Torot. It also says, Vayomer Hashem Moshe Alei Elai Ahar Vayesh Sham V'Tena Lecha Et Luchot HaEven VeHaTorah VeHaMitzvah Shekatavti Leorotam. Luchot HaEven, the tablets, is referring to the Ten Commandments. HaTorah is talking about the Torah Shebechtav. VeHaMitzvah is talking about the Torah Shebal Peh. This is what the Rambam brings in the introduction of one of his books. Another very important point is that as we learn the Torah and as we learn the commentaries on the Torah, we have to remember a very important pasuk. Al pi haTorah sheyorucha v'al hamishpat sheyomru lecha ta'aseh lo tasub min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'shmol. Whatever the rabbis tell you, you should not move away from it, not to the right and not to the left. In other words, in the end, the Torah is telling us very clearly and emphasizing that they have been given the authority to make a final determination as long as they don't move away from the Torah itself. In other words, as long as what they say does not contradict that which has already been established. Nobody can come and say something which is different or opposed to the Torah. But if they come and clarify and what they're saying or their opinion that is being given is substantiated by that which is written in the Torah elsewhere, that's perfectly fine. And we have to listen to them. So this is an important pasuk, important instruction for all generations, that the Chachamim have the samchut, they have the authority, and we don't have the ability to oppose them. Some groups, of course, did not like this. But the Torah says it clearly. Now, if you trust the Torah, then what are you going to do with this? So you know what they may claim? Okay, their rabbi is just as much as the other rabbis are. Well, in order for somebody to be qualified, he really has to be knowledgeable, he has to be accepted. Not everybody is accepted. Unfortunately, sometimes people think that they can give an opinion. In order for somebody to give an opinion, number one, he has to be a God-fearing person, he has to be knowledgeable in the Torah, in the halakha, he has to be an expert in the area that he's giving an opinion. It's not just open for anybody to give an opinion. And whatever he says has to be substantiated. It cannot contradict that which is already written. So let's begin with a few examples where you will see clearly that without Torah Shebal Peh, no way you would be able to figure out. Brit Milah, right? This is a famous mitzvah that happens at the 8th day for a boy. What do you do to the boy? It says, Vayom Hashemini Yimol Besar Orlator. You remove his foreskin. And now I just told you that Orla means foreskin. How do you know what Orla is? If you look at the Torah and you look for the word Orla, you will find Orla in other connotations too. You will find Orla by fruit. When you plant a tree, the first 3 years you can't eat from the fruit. Even here in LA, you plant a tree, the first 3 years, if you're starting from scratch, the first few the first fruits that grow during the first 3 years is orla. Orla meaning it's like blocked. It cannot be consumed. So orla here doesn't mean a foreskin, right? It has something to do with fruits. Varaltem orlato et piryo. Another one, umaltem et orlat lebavchem. Don't be stubborn. The Torah tells us, circumcise your heart. What are you going to circumcise in your heart? The veins, the arteries. I mean, what is it to circumcise? But the Torah says there's some orla in the lev. We, in our hearts, sometimes have a blockage, something that is preventing us from doing the mitzvah. Stubbornness, whatever you want to call it. The Torah calls it orlat lev. The Torah, the lev, the heart is being blocked by something. So you have to circumcise it. So perhaps, if we look at the word orla and we search for the meaning of Brit Milah, maybe it meant to circumcise our hearts. How do we know it's the Brit Milah? How do we know it's that part of the body? Or Orla Toznam, maybe we should do Brit Milah at the ear, because the word Orla also appears by the ear. Al mi adabera ve'ida v'yishma'u hineh arela oznam ve'lo yuklu lakshiv. Their ears are blocked. They have an Orla at their ear. So perhaps Brit Milah should be done at the ear. But we know we don't do that. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't speak to Paro. I can't speak to the Jewish nation. I stutter. How does stuttering, how is it called in Hebrew? Vani aral sefatayim. You see the word arla? Orla, aral? So maybe Brit Milah is at the lips. Because that's where we find the word orla. So how do you know Brit Milah is Brit Milah where it is? Only through Torah Shebal Peh. Without Torah Shebal Peh, without the tradition being handed over, that is where you perform the Brit Milah. By reading the mitzvah orla, I wouldn't know where it is. How do you do it? How do you know where to do it? How about mitzvah tefillin? Anybody know how to make tefillin? All it says is vayale ota yadecha letotafot b'neinecha. What's totafot? How do you know totafot is black? How do you know the difference between the one you put on your hand, the one you put on your head? How do you know that it's supposed to have straps? How do you know that it's square? How do you know what you put into the box? You see how many details? How do you know that there is a sheen on the box? So many details. How do you know which one to put on first? Perhaps you should put the head first. No, we put on the hand first. There's so many details. We don't even know what it looks like unless it's been handed down orally, balpeh, by word of mouth. Of course, today it's written down, but just by reading the Torah, how do you know what it is? And some Karaites, I think, used to actually put the tefillin ben einecha, in between their eyes. That's what it says, ben einecha, right here. Well, we know ben einecha means on the top of your head, where the hair ends, or where the hair begins. By the way, how does somebody who's bald put on tefillin? Where does he know where to put it? He looks at an old album, an old picture of his, and sees where the hair began, and that's where he knows where to put the tefillin. But every generation, the father has taught the son, or the teacher, the rabbi has taught the children how to put on tefillin and what they look like. The next mitzvah is Arba'at Minim. On Sukkot we have the 4 minim, the 4 mitzvot. What are they? The etrog, the hadas, the lulav, and the arava, right? It says pri etz hadar. That's the etrog. How do you know etz hadar is etrog? Perhaps it's an avocado, or an orange, or a mango. I mean, well, how do you know it's an etrog, the citron fruit? Where do you know that from? We know that because of tradition. We know that because of Torah Shebal Peh. That this is the fruit. That this is the hadas. That this is the arava. That this is the lulav. The next mitzvah is Shabbat. Zachor et yom ha-Shabbat lekadesho. What does Zachor mean? To remember? Or, as the rabbis tell us, but through the Torah Shebal Peh, to actually talk about it, to make kiddush. Zochreu al hayayin. We have wine. That's in the Torah Shebal Peh. Lekadesho, what does the kadesho mean? To sanctify. How do you sanctify Shabbat? And another famous example of how you need Torah Shebal Peh is what happens on Shabbat? Lo ta'aseh kol melacha. You cannot do any work. You have to abstain from work. What's work? Somebody has 1,000 chickens. 1,000 chickens in his coop? Is that what they call it? A chicken coop? Can he feed them on Shabbat? That's his work. He does that a whole week. It's a lot of work. Is he allowed to feed 1,000 chickens? It's his chickens. Yes, he's allowed to. It's his. You're allowed to feed your own. That's what you have to take care of. You're allowed to feed. But that's work. That's not prohibited work. You have a big heavy table that weighs 300 pounds. Can you move it from this corner of the room to that corner? Yes. But can you take a handkerchief outside in the Reshut HaRabim in the street? A handkerchief just weighs a couple ounces. No. You see? We wouldn't understand from this what's melacha. It doesn't say avodah. It doesn't say lo ta'aseh kol avodah, physical labor. It says melacha. Melacha has something to do with something that is creative. Something that we do a whole week. And we cannot do on Shabbat because in order to experience Shabbat properly, we have to abstain from certain melachot that were present in the Mishkan. 39 of them, 39 categories of work that we wouldn't know what they are unless we had the Torah Shebal Peh that explains to us what the Torah, what the melacha is. In other words, what is exactly prohibited. Nida. It says, "Velisha benidat tumata lo tikrav legalot ervatah." As you know, a woman once a month cannot be with her husband physically, intimately. But here it says, "Lo tikrav." Don't get close to her.
It's not just once a month. It's the approximately 12 days.
Well, it depends. Yeah.
But people have to understand it's not just
Yeah.
once a month.
It can. Yeah. Depending on the woman, every so often she's unclean for a number of days, and there's no physical contact. Now we know that at that time it's a sur for them to be together. Physically, they cannot have an intimate relationship. But here the pasuk says lo tikrav, don't get close. What does that mean, lo tikrav? Are you allowed to hug or kiss? You wouldn't know that from this. The Torah Shebal Peh says no, you cannot do that either. No hugging or kissing during that time. And as I've explained at other opportunities, that is a great time for the couple to get to see if they can really love each other and respect each other even without any physical contact. Because sometimes the physical contact is artificial. It is not real. It does not really reflect one's feelings. But anyway, without the Torah Shebal Peh, we would not know what exactly is permissible and what is not. We spoke earlier about the importance of the vowels. Now I'm going to give you an example of how you'd be totally lost if you would not know the correct vowels of this word. Can everybody see the pasuk here? The pasuk speaks here about a woman giving birth. There's a difference between giving birth to a girl or giving birth to a boy regarding the amount of time that she would be unclean, when she would become completely clean. And the pasuk says, "V'im nekevat teled v'tame'ah," and she will become unclean for how many days? Can anybody read that word? The letters are Shin, Bet, Ayin, Yud, Mem. I'm reading Shiv'im, 70. She should be unclean for 70. After all, later after the word Keninatah, it says, "V'shishim yom v'sheshet yamim." There's 66 days to Shev al Bnei Tahorah. 66 clean days. So maybe Shin, Bet, Ayin, Yud, Mem means Shiv'im. Or maybe it means Sab'im, to be satisfied. Here, obviously we would not understand it to be satisfied over here because it has nothing to do with the text. But who's to tell you what these letters are? 70 or 2 weeks? Shvu'aim, as we know it. It really does say Shvu'aim. But without the vowels, what are you going to do with it? How do you know what it says? Next, Lo tevashel gdi, do not cook a young goat, behelev or behalav. You cannot cook the meat in the fat or in milk. Chet lamed bet can be halav, milk, or it could be haleb. It could be haleb, it's a fat, a forbidden fat that we do not have, we do not eat. You're allowed to have the shuman, which is a little bit more transparent, but the haleb is white like snow. It has to be removed prior to salting the meat. The word b'haleb, what are you supposed to make of it? If you would not have the vowels, you would not know. It actually is talking about milk. However, it could also be haleb, kol haleb v'chol dam lo tochelu. You cannot have the fat and you cannot have the blood. Which one is it? We need the vowels. The vowels are part of Torah Shebal Peh. Another quick example of Ta'amei Mikra, which act like commas and periods that are important. Also in letting us know the meaning of the pasuk. Somebody kidnaps another Jew, sells him, and he's found, he's put to death. Where do you put the comma here? Through his hand he will be put to death. Or, as we read it, here the comma makes a big difference in how you interpret this verse. Another example, וישלח פרעה ויקרא למשה ולאהרון ויאמר להם חטאתי הפעם השם הצדיק ואני ועמי ה'. I'm sorry, I sinned. Hashem is the just one, He's the right one, and me and my people are the wicked. What about putting the comma elsewhere? הפעם השם הצדיק ואני ועמי הרשעים. He puts the comma after Va'ani. Perhaps he's talking about himself, that Hashem and himself are the righteous one and his people are to blame. You see how the comma can also make a difference. ולפני עיוור לא תיתן מכשול. Do not put a stumbling block before a blind person. ויראת מאלוהיך אני השם. Be fearful of God. It says before a blind person. Is that what it really means? Before a blind person you can't put a stumbling block? Does anybody know what this pasuk really means?
Bad advice.
That's right. You're not allowed to give somebody bad advice. Then why does it say Iver, here blind? The simple meaning is because he's blind to that fact. And you are aware of it. Why does the Torah use the word Iver? There are no synonyms in the Torah. There's a reason for every word white is being used. Iver, the man, the individual here is not physically blind necessarily. Spiritually, he could be blind. What does it mean to be spiritually blind? When the Torah tells us about bribes. A bribe can blind you. Is it really blinding you physically? No. But the word iver or ye'aver is used in that context to mislead. But without the Torah Shebal Peh, we wouldn't know that, because if you translate it literally, just before a blind man, you don't put a stumbling block. Before somebody else, either he knows about it or he doesn't. If he doesn't know about it, too bad. No, Chaz Hashem, you're not allowed to mislead anybody. You can't tell him, I'm selling you the car as is, when you know that the transmission is going to go kaput after a couple minutes, after a couple blocks.
But if you tell him as is, then you're being honest with him.
No. But if you know for sure that the transmission is no good, you can't tell him as is. Unless you tell him, I advise you to check it with a mechanic. Because the guy may not know. Maybe he's a simple guy, he doesn't know about cars. What does it mean as is? Okay, it means that there's, with this paint job and with the used tires. So you have to really be careful. If you really know.
But American law, you just say as is, and you put it in writing, you've covered yourself.
Right? That's American law, but not Jewish law. We have to be honest. Now, somebody might say, oh, I didn't know it was bad. That's why anytime our intentions are not known, it says the extra words in the Torah. Ve'areta me'Hashem Elokecha. Hashem knows. He reads your mind. He knows exactly what your intentions are. Anytime, kol davar masur lalev ne'emar bo ve'areta me'Hashem Elokecha. Don't think that you can get away with it. Hashem knows exactly what you were thinking. That you were aware of this very well. Just another few examples of words that make a difference. Latet, lasim. To give or to present. To give and to present are very different. To give means, as we said before, just to give physically, but not necessarily to explain what you're giving over. And the same thing with the word michshol. Even though michshol means a stumbling block, as we just said, it does not necessarily mean a physical stumbling block. It just means any form of misleading that this man may not be aware of, that he's falling into a trap, is called a michshol. And one, of course, has to be careful with saying anything that that may sound like, well, I didn't know, because, as I said before, Hashem knows. Hashem knows exactly what our intentions are. One more example of a very significant mitzvah that without the Torah Shebal Peh would be completely lost is the mitzvah of shechita. How do you slaughter an animal? It says, whenever you want to eat meat, it says, and you will slaughter the animal as I have instructed you, and then you will eat it. What does it mean, kasher tziviticha, as I instructed you? Where did you instruct me? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah how do you slaughter an animal. That you have to sever the food pipe, the windpipe, and the two arteries that run between the two, that the blood oil has to come out. You have to examine the animal, that there's no trefot in there. It's not a simple matter to eat kosher. It's not enough that you're eating a clean animal. You have to prepare it properly. Shechita has to be done right, otherwise it's a nevela. Kasher tziviticha means as you were instructed. That means all the details were given to you. Where and how? In a Torah Shebal Peh, in the oral tradition. All of that Moshe received. Otherwise, how do we know how to slaughter today? That the knife cannot have any pegimot, right? It has to be smooth. So kasher tziviticha means in the Torah Shebal Peh. Just another question or two that we need to understand when talking about the Torah Shebal Peh is, it's strange that as we go down in history and time goes by, there are more and more books that are being written about everything. Just look at the amount of books that we have now. What's going on over here? Why was there a need to write more, to make more commentaries, more clarifications, more books? I mean, Torah Shebal Peh is basically the Mishnayot, the Gemara, perhaps the Rambam, but why do you have to have, and every generation has more and more compilations, further clarification, further commenting on what has already been written before? So the rabbi tells in the Gemara that every generation becomes weaker than the previous generation. As it is stated in Masechet Shabbat, Rav Zera said, if the first generations were like angels, then we are like human beings. If they were like human beings, we are like donkeys. And not just like any donkey, in other words, not like the donkey of Rav Hanina ben Dosa or Rav Pinchas ben Yair, but plain donkeys. What kind of donkey did Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa or Rav Pinchas ben Yair have that they were better? Yeah. So this was the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. You see, this is what he looked like approximately. In Masechet Chulin, it's brought down that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair came to an inn, and they gave some food for his donkey. The donkey would not want to eat from it, so they started, hitting him, and he didn't eat. He didn't budge. So they asked the owner, "What's going on over here?" So he says, perhaps, you know what, I have a feeling that you didn't take ma'aser from this wheat. You didn't take the 10% off the tithing. And my donkey is very careful. He does not eat food that no ma'aser was taken off. In other words, he does not want to he does not want to do an avera. So you're giving him tevel. Tevel is the food where trumot and ma'asot will not remove. In other words, he's a very careful donkey. So we're not talking about these kind of donkeys. You're saying we are really much weaker in our understanding than the previous generations. We don't really come close to what they knew. The further we go away from Sinai, the less we know. The weaker the generation is. The closer one is to Sinai, the better their understanding of the mitzvot and the halachot is. That is why we have so much respect for the previous generations. And finally, What you see over here is a nice picture of what appears to be a grandfather and his grandson, perhaps. In the pasuk "V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shiktecha bevetecha uletecha b'derech," the importance of transmitting the Torah to future generations is something that we say in the Shema, something that we have to do by example, something that is our responsibility. And if we do not know enough of the Torah, then we have to make sure we send our children to a good school where they will give over that precious asset that we call the Torah. Just want to finish with a story that occurred on an airplane about 20 years ago, perhaps 25 years ago. On a flight from Israel to New York, I think it was, or from New York to Israel. There was a rabbi sitting down next to his son, and there was a secular Jew who was a very famous professor sitting down next to his son. And this is a long flight. So the professor, the secular professor, was able to observe the rabbi and his son. And towards the end of the flight, he comes over to the rabbi and says, I have to ask you a question. It is incredible the kavod, the respect that your son was giving you throughout the flight. He got up for you. He took care of whatever you needed. Wow. I don't have that kind of kavod for my son. On the contrary, I'm the one that has to do everything for him. He doesn't do anything for me. Why is it that by you, but the religious Jews, there's so much kavod for the parents, for the elderly, and by us it's not like that? Rabbi, can you explain that to me? So the rabbi says it's very, very simple. By us, by the religious Jews, the further you go back in time, the closer we were to Sinai. So therefore there's more kavod for the previous generation. They knew more. They were greater. They were holier. So the younger generation always has more respect for the older generation. But by you believe man came from a monkey. So the further you go back, the more primitive you are. So that's why you're giving more kavod to your son. Because apparently, you're more primitive than him. Right? Isn't that the way it works? I mean, the more advanced, right, the more kavod. And today, the kids are more advanced. They know more about certain things. But the reality is that the Torah makes it very clear that we need to have kavod for the previous generation. In order for the Torah to survive, it needs to be respected. We need to respect those who have transmitted the Torah. We have to have kavod for the rabbis, right? We have to have kavod for any composition that was written by a great rabbi, because simply he must have known more than us. We cannot just contest what he said if he was from a totally different generation. It's not so easy to just get up, I disagree with him. Who are you? I mean, you're so far removed from Sinai. How could you dare get up and oppose or argue, unless of course he's within the same generation and you're just as knowledgeable or have same familiarity with the text as he does. But otherwise, for us to get up and contest or oppose somebody from the past, it shows chutzpah. It shows a lack of kavod for that which we know has always been holy. And unfortunately, that is what has happened to many Jews throughout history. Many of them have become distant and have lost their respect for the Torah and for the Chachamim. And when you lose respect for your tradition, then of course, you're going to little by little lose any interest in observing any mitzvah whatsoever, because one thing leads to another. That is why in the generation of Mashiach, the rabbis tell us, chutzpah yizgeh. There will be an increase in abundance of chutzpah, of audacity. Children will not look up to their parents. And that will explain too why there is a interruption between the previous generation and the following generation, because of this chutzpah. When a child does not respect his parent, he does not respect his parent's tradition. That's how you begin to become secular, because at some point the grandfather was religious. At some point everybody was. Then what happened to the child, to the grandson? He was not respectful of that father, and therefore he was not respectful of this tradition. But the good news is, Veshiv levavot al banim velebanim al avotam. Right? Eliyahu Navi will come right before Mashiach comes, and he will bring about an incredible revolution. And that is the revolution of Teshuvah, that will also include children, B'ezrat Hashem, bringing back their own parents' b'teshuvah. This is our time. We're living it through today. We're seeing, Baruch Hashem, the yeshivot that were destroyed in Europe being rebuilt in Eretz Yisrael and in America. the Torah is Baruch Hashem making a great comeback. Thank you very much.
Amen.